Behind Ontario's high stone walls in 1932, a person could be declared insane without proof, trial, or warning, only a signature and a sentence. In a province chasing order, difference became a diagnosis, and a hospital became a holding facility where names turned into case numbers. A mother who argued, an artist who refused routine, a worker who spoke too loudly, each could be admitted, labeled, and kept. Inside, corridors swallowed footsteps, files replaced voices, and treatments were carried out with cold efficiency. The question was not who was ill, it was who was allowed to remain outside. In 1932, Ontario became the stage for a story that would cast a long shadow over the history of psychiatric care in Canada. The Ontario Hospital, an institution meant to house and treat the mentally ill, would become infamous for something far darker than simply its function. Here, sanity itself was diagnosed as a disease. Imagine a time when the line between sanity and madness was blurred to the point where simply being different, acting outside the societal norms, or even exhibiting the slightest deviation from the rigid expectations of the time could result in a terrifying label: insanity. This is where we begin our exploration into one of the most chilling tales of institutionalized control over the human mind. The Ontario Hospital, or what would later come to be known as the psychiatric prison of the mind, held patients behind its high stone walls, walls that were as thick and imposing as the assumptions of the medical professionals inside. It was not a place where healing happened. It was where conformity was demanded and difference was punished. As you walk through the corridors of this forgotten institution, you begin to realize that the very idea of what it meant to be sane or insane was being twisted by those in power, manipulated to serve the needs of a society that sought to suppress, rather than understand, the complexities of the human mind. In this chilling context, individuals who were sent to Ontario Hospital were often those who had no place in the world outside of it. Some were mothers who dared to challenge traditional gender roles. Others were artists or free thinkers whose creativity was mistaken for madness. There were even whispers about the wealthy, the powerful individuals who could be sent away for reasons that seemed arbitrary or politically motivated. What was even more disturbing was the fact that, within these walls, patients had no true voice. They were diagnosed, treated, and often forgotten. A diagnosis of insanity in this hospital did not require evidence of actual mental illness. It was enough that someone could not or would not conform to the status quo. The troubling question at the heart of this hospital's operations was, what truly constituted insanity? Was it the mind's inability to function normally, or was it simply a failure to act according to societal expectations? The term sanity itself was being used not as a measure of mental health, but as a tool of control. To understand this, one has to look not only at the scientific and medical aspects of the time, but also at the cultural pressures, societal values, and the historical context in which these individuals lived. The early 20th century was a time when scientific knowledge about mental health was still in its infancy, and the tools used to treat patients were rudimentary at best. The methods were invasive, crude, and often left patients more broken than when they entered. Take, for instance, the rise of institutionalization during this period. With overcrowded asylums across the continent, many believed that removing those who were different from the rest of society would be the most effective solution. These individuals, many of whom could have been classified as simply eccentric or rebellious, were often deemed a threat to societal order. Mental illness, at this time, was frequently seen through a moral lens. Patients were deemed morally defective, or their behavior was interpreted as a weakness of will or character. Madness was something contagious, something that could spread if left unchecked. It was not simply an illness to be treated, but a societal defect to be eradicated. Inside Ontario Hospital, this mindset took on a terrifying form. Doctors and psychiatrists did not necessarily see themselves as healers, but as enforcers of a rigid set of cultural norms. If someone refused to follow social rules, whether out of rebellion, illness, or simply being misunderstood, they were labeled as insane. The hospital staff and leadership began to form a dangerous belief that madness was not just a medical issue, it was a societal one, one that could be diagnosed in anyone who posed a threat to the status quo. This belief permeated the hospital's operations, leading to questionable treatment methods, unethical practices, and the forced confinement of individuals who had done nothing more than challenge the norms of their time. What makes this history even darker is the fact that many patients did not even know why they were there. They were sent away by families, by spouses, by society itself, without ever being given a real chance to fight back. Imagine being trapped in a place where you were told that your thoughts, your actions, and your very existence were evidence of a disease you had no control over. In such an environment, madness becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Each new patient brought in, every new case of insanity diagnosed, only served to reinforce the idea that sanity could, in fact, be a disease in itself. Yet, as more and more individuals entered the hospital under the broad and ambiguous diagnosis of insanity, the boundaries of what could be considered mad expanded. Men and women who had once been seen as rational, upstanding members of society suddenly found themselves locked in the same cages as the truly disturbed. There was a dark and twisted irony in the fact that those deemed sane by society's standards were now subject to the same harsh conditions that patients diagnosed with real mental illnesses endured. In a place where every deviation from the norm was considered evidence of insanity, there was little room left for mercy, understanding, or compassion. This is where the tragedy of Ontario Hospital reaches its apex. As the years passed, the hospital's practices became more ingrained, and the idea of sanity as a disease only grew stronger. The idea was not just accepted, it became the accepted reality. Those who sought help, those who were simply struggling, were swept up in a system that refused to see them as individuals. They were treated as cases, as symptoms of a disease that needed to be eradicated. And in doing so, the hospital inadvertently created a new breed of madness. The madness of being trapped in a world where sanity itself could become a punishment. It was within this framework of medical malpractice, moral rigidity, and bureaucratic indifference that Ontario Hospital became infamous. And yet, despite the grimness of its legacy, the hospital's existence highlights something deeply profound about human nature. It reveals how fragile the line between normality and madness can be, how easily it can be blurred, and how those who challenge societal expectations can become victims of a system that is supposed to protect them. The tragedy of Ontario Hospital is not just in the way it treated its patients, but in the way it defined sanity as a disease. It is a reminder that the human mind is not a simple thing to categorize, and that perhaps in its deepest and most mysterious parts, it should never be classified at all. As we delve deeper into the twisted history of the Ontario Hospital, we begin to understand that what happened here was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader, more pervasive issue within psychiatric institutions across the world, a dark, murky history of treating individuals not as patients, but as problems to be solved, diseases to be contained. And the legacy of Ontario Hospital continues to resonate as the battle between normality and madness rages on in modern psychiatry. The story of the Ontario Hospital is not just a tale of a single institution, but a reflection of the broader medical, social, and cultural forces at play during a pivotal moment in history. The early 20th century was a time when mental health was only beginning to emerge as a legitimate field of medical study, yet it was still steeped in superstition, moral judgment, and fear. Understanding the historical and cultural context of this period is essential to grasp how the Ontario Hospital became a symbol of a much larger, darker movement in psychiatric care. In the 1930s, Ontario was a province that was deeply affected by the pressures of industrialization, urbanization, and the cultural shifts that were occurring across the Western world. There was a desire to build a modern society, but in this pursuit, mental illness was often seen as a threat to this emerging order. This era was one of sweeping change, but also deepening anxiety. Industrial growth and the rise of urban centers created new social dynamics, which in turn sparked fear of the unknown, the uncontrollable, and the deviant. It was a time when society, particularly the growing middle class, feared the breakdown of moral codes and traditional values. This climate of fear had a direct impact on how mental health was perceived. Mental illness, in the eyes of many, was still an enigma, a mysterious affliction that did not quite fit within the neatly defined categories of medical science. It was often viewed as a moral failing or a consequence of personal weakness, rather than a complex neurobiological condition. People suffering from mental health issues were thought to be a danger, not only to themselves but to the broader society. This fear of the mentally ill, combined with an ignorance of how to properly treat such conditions, led to the widespread belief that the mentally ill should be removed from society, isolated in asylums or hospitals where their behavior could be controlled and studied. Ontario Hospital was a product of this environment. It was founded in a time when psychiatric care was still in its infancy, and when treatments were often little more than guesswork. There was no clear understanding of the underlying causes of mental illness. Theories ranged from the moral, that insanity was a sign of weakness or sin, to the physical, that it was a result of organic disease or injury. The medical community itself was still divided on what could be classified as a mental illness and how it should be treated. This uncertainty bred a climate of fear and suspicion, where any deviation from societal norms could be construed as insanity. It was also a time when psychological theories, while still in their infancy, were gaining traction. Figures like Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung were gaining recognition in the field of psychology, but their theories were still far from being accepted as the standard in medical care. Psychiatrists were more likely to rely on outdated, primitive methods of treatment such as bloodletting, lobotomies, or electroshock therapy. These treatments were based on the belief that the mind and body were deeply interconnected and that mental illness could be cured through physical intervention. At the time, there was no real understanding of the brain's complexity, and treatments were often harmful, based on little more than trial and error. The Ontario Hospital was emblematic of this era of experimentation. Doctors were wielding untested methods, and patients were often subjected to painful and degrading treatments with no scientific backing. As Ontario Hospital opened its doors to patients in the early 1900s, it became clear that it would be more than just a place for those with obvious mental illnesses. It was a reflection of the period's broader belief that any form of deviance, whether social, political, or personal, could be categorized as a mental illness. The hospital, then, became a repository not only for those who were suffering from severe psychological disorders, but for anyone whose behavior deviated from what was deemed normal. This blurred the line between illness and difference. People who were merely considered eccentric, who did not fit neatly into the boxes of society's expectations, were often sent there to be treated. This system was deeply rooted in a desire for conformity. There was a general anxiety about the rise of new social movements, the spread of unconventional ideas, and the breakdown of traditional gender roles. Women, for example, were particularly vulnerable to psychiatric diagnoses that pathologized their behaviors. Women who were too outspoken, too independent, or simply too defiant of societal norms were frequently labeled as hysterical or insane. The same could be said for men who failed to conform to the traditional ideals of masculinity, those who were perceived as weak, effeminate, or overly emotional. For many, the hospital became a prison where not only mental illness, but also nonconformity was punished. It was in this climate of uncertainty and fear that the concept of mental illness began to be redefined by those in power. The psychiatric field, while still in a state of development, had established that people who exhibited behaviors outside of the norm could be classified as insane. The concept of mental illness was used to justify a system of control over individuals, over families, and over society itself. The Ontario Hospital, with its mission to treat, or more accurately, to house, the insane, became a focal point for this medical and societal drive for conformity. The Ontario Hospital was emblematic of the broadening of psychiatric definitions during this time. Whereas mental illness had once been a relatively narrow diagnosis, encompassing only the most severe forms of mental breakdown, it now became an umbrella term that could encompass a wide range of behaviors. Depression, anxiety, and even what we might now classify as neurodivergence were included under the broad label of insanity. This expansion of the definition allowed for the pathologization of a large portion of the population, those who, for various reasons, did not fit the prescribed norms of society. The treatment methods employed at Ontario Hospital were a direct reflection of the medical practices of the time. They were invasive, untested, and often harmful. Electroshock therapy, a procedure that involved applying an electrical current to the brain, was widely used. While it was believed to help reset the brain, it was frequently used as a way to control unruly patients rather than as an effective treatment. Lobotomies, a procedure that involved removing parts of the brain, were also used on patients, often with devastating consequences. These treatments were based on the flawed understanding that the physical brain was the sole cause of mental illness, disregarding the emotional and psychological factors that played a crucial role. At Ontario Hospital, patients were not individuals but cases to be managed. The idea that mental illness could be a social construct, a condition influenced by the culture, environment, and circumstances, was still far beyond the grasp of medical professionals. The hospital's administrators, far more concerned with managing large numbers of patients and maintaining control, adhered to a clinical, detached approach to care. The goal was not to heal, but to normalize, to force patients into conformity with societal expectations. This outlook turned what could have been a place of care into a mechanism for social control. It turned mental health care into a form of punishment for those who dared to live outside the box. As we begin to understand the historical backdrop in which the Ontario Hospital operated, it becomes clear that this was not an isolated incident. Rather, it was a reflection of the larger attitudes toward mental illness and social deviance in the early 20th century. It was a time of uncertainty and fear, and the mental health field reflected this chaos. Ontario Hospital, like many other institutions of the time, was not a place of healing, but a place of containment. It was a place where society's fears were projected onto individuals who were labeled insane for no other reason than their difference from the norm. This tragic, flawed institution became a symbol of how a society, in its attempt to control and define sanity, lost sight of the humanity of those it confined. The hospital's story, like that of many psychiatric institutions, is a dark reminder of the dangers of rigid thinking, of the harm that can come from labeling individuals as other. It is a reminder of how history's understanding of mental health can be shaped by fear, prejudice, and ignorance. And as we reflect on this tragic chapter, we cannot help but ask, how much have we really changed? How much of that mindset still lingers today, hidden beneath the surface of modern psychiatry and the ways we understand and treat mental illness? The notion of sanity as a disease cannot be fully understood without examining the political and societal forces that shaped the medical landscape of the early 20th century. The 1930s were a time of great societal transformation, but also of great uncertainty. The world was reeling from the aftermath of the First World War, an event that left deep psychological scars across the globe. The social upheaval, economic instability, and the disillusionment that followed the war had a profound impact on people's perceptions of reality, and these perceptions would feed directly into the way mental illness was understood and treated. Psychiatry was not immune to the political climate of the time, and the Ontario Hospital was an institution that reflected the tensions between medical science and the social agenda of the day. During this period, mental health care was not as much about understanding the intricacies of the human mind as it was about maintaining control. Sanity was not just a medical diagnosis, it was also a tool of social order. The ruling medical professionals of the time, many of whom were influenced by the prevailing social attitudes of the era, saw mental illness through a rigid lens of moral and political conformity. Individuals who failed to conform to societal standards, whether due to unconventional behavior, non-traditional gender roles, or outspoken political views, were often labeled as insane. The label of insanity thus became a convenient tool to silence dissent and marginalize those who could not or would not adhere to the norm. In Ontario, the hospital system, like so many others in the world, was a reflection of these broader social fears. As urbanization and industrialization took root, there was a growing fear of chaos, disorder, and the breakdown of traditional values. As the world moved forward, society increasingly placed value on productivity, conformity, and economic success. In this framework, those who did not fit the mold, who did not contribute to the collective economic or social machine, were seen as liabilities. It was in this environment that the Ontario Hospital flourished, a place where nonconformity was often treated as a symptom of a larger, more dangerous illness. This political backdrop not only shaped the way mental illness was diagnosed, but it also influenced the methods used to treat it. The medical community was still experimenting with various theories of psychiatry, and many of the treatments used at the time were based on outdated and unproven notions of mental health. Electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, for instance, was being used to treat everything from depression to hysteria, with little regard for the long-term effects it would have on patients. Lobotomies were another popular but controversial treatment, one that involved surgically severing parts of the brain in an effort to control troublesome or insane behaviors. These treatments were often used not out of a genuine desire to heal, but as a means to control and pacify patients who did not fit the accepted societal norms. The politics of sanity went beyond just medical practices. In Ontario and throughout much of the Western world, there was a strong belief that mental illness was contagious, something that could spread if left unchecked. This belief in the infectious nature of insanity contributed to the widespread institutionalization of those deemed mentally ill. Rather than seeking to understand the root causes of mental illness, whether they were psychological, environmental, or genetic, society chose to lock away those who displayed troubling or unconventional behaviors. In many ways, the treatment of mental illness during this time was more about containment than care. The very idea of madness became politicized, and it was used as a tool to control and segregate those who were perceived as dangerous or threatening to societal stability. At Ontario Hospital, this mindset took on its most insidious form. The institution became a clearinghouse for anyone who deviated from the norm, whether that norm was defined by behavior, beliefs, or appearance. The idea that sanity could be diagnosed as a disease was not simply an intellectual exercise. It was a manifestation of a societal need to control the boundaries of normalcy. The doctors and administrators at Ontario Hospital, like their counterparts in other institutions, were caught in a web of medical uncertainty, societal fear, and political pressure. For them, the line between insanity and sanity was no longer a question of medical science, but one of social convenience. Diagnosing insanity became a way to remove inconvenient people from society, a way to silence those who posed a threat to the existing order. The medical professionals who worked at Ontario Hospital were not necessarily malicious. In fact, many of them likely believed they were doing the right thing, treating individuals who were seen as dangerous to the fabric of society. The psychiatric community, at the time, was struggling to reconcile its growing understanding of the human mind with the political realities of the day. It was a time when social scientists, political leaders, and the medical profession were all trying to define what it meant to be normal. The lines between medical diagnoses and social judgment became so blurred that patients could be institutionalized, not for what they had, but for who they were or what they believed. This politically charged atmosphere affected the treatment of women in particular. In the early 20th century, the role of women in society was rapidly changing, and those women who defied traditional gender roles, whether through political activism, intellectual pursuits, or simple acts of independence, were often labeled as hysterical or mentally ill. The Ontario Hospital, like many others, became a repository for women whose behaviors were considered outside the accepted norms of the time. Women who were outspoken, who demanded rights, or who sought autonomy were often dismissed as being mad or hysterical. The diagnosis of insanity was not just about medical treatment. It was a convenient way to control a population that was seen as threatening the established order. Men, too, were subjected to the same treatment, though often for different reasons. For men who did not fit into the traditional mold of masculinity, who were introverted, sensitive, or nonconformist, diagnoses of insanity were often used as a way to explain their deviation from the norm. The medical community, under the influence of societal pressures, had developed an understanding of mental illness that was based on rigid gender and class expectations. Those who did not conform to the roles expected of them, whether as men or women, were deemed mentally unstable, and their difference was treated as a disease that needed to be eradicated. In this environment, the practice of diagnosing sanity as a disease was not just a product of scientific misunderstanding. It was a product of deep-seated societal fears about order and conformity. Those who failed to meet the expectations of society were labeled as mentally ill, their differences pathologized, and their behaviors criminalized. The Ontario Hospital was one of the key institutions that perpetuated this troubling mindset, where sanity itself was not an absolute measure of mental health, but a tool for maintaining control over a population that was increasingly seen as unruly and unpredictable. The very essence of the hospital's existence, the belief that those who deviate from the norm are inherently sick, reflects the broader political ideologies of the time. What is particularly unsettling about this period in psychiatric history is the extent to which these ideologies became embedded in medical practice. Psychiatry, rather than becoming a field of healing, was being used to enforce social order. The diagnosis of insanity became a means of protecting a world that was afraid of change, afraid of difference, and ultimately afraid of what might happen if those who challenged the status quo were allowed to roam free. The Ontario Hospital's approach to treating mental illness was a direct consequence of these political, medical, and societal pressures. It was an institution where medicine and politics intersected in the most dangerous of ways, where the line between treating a mental illness and suppressing a person's right to individuality was blurred beyond recognition. As the hospital grew and evolved, so too did the belief that sanity was a disease to be controlled. The tragedy of the Ontario Hospital was not just that it housed those who were mentally ill, but that it became a place where society's fears were projected onto those who did not conform. It became a monument to the political uses of psychiatry and the dangers of turning medicine into a tool for social control. The figures at the center of the Ontario Hospital's operations were not simply doctors or psychiatrists. They were the architects of a deeply problematic and damaging medical system. These individuals, responsible for diagnosing and treating mental illness, were not only dealing with complex human emotions and psychological states, but they were also positioned within a social and political landscape that shaped their views on what it meant to be sane or insane. These professionals were the gatekeepers who determined who would enter the institution, who would be confined, and who would receive treatment. But their decisions were not always grounded in genuine medical care. Instead, they were influenced by broader cultural and social pressures that often conflated morality with mental health, behavior with illness, and deviation from the norm with disease. The doctors at Ontario Hospital operated in a time when psychiatric care was still in its infancy, and much of the knowledge we now take for granted about mental illness, its causes, its treatments, and its various manifestations, was either unknown or in its very early stages. The medical field itself was in a state of flux, with debates about the effectiveness of different treatments and the fundamental nature of mental illness itself. At the same time, the cultural climate of the era was intensely concerned with maintaining social order, and the line between mental illness and societal nonconformity was often blurred. In this context, the psychiatrists at Ontario Hospital became more than just medical professionals. They became enforcers of a social order that equated deviation with insanity. It is important to recognize that the professionals working within the hospital were often well-meaning in their desire to help those they believed to be suffering. However, they were operating under the constraints of a medical paradigm that was deeply flawed. Many of the doctors who worked at the Ontario Hospital were highly regarded in their field, often with years of education and training, but their understanding of mental illness was based on outdated theories and practices. The dominant medical model of the time still treated mental illness as an organic disease that could be treated with physical interventions, such as electroshock therapy or lobotomies. These treatments were often used in an attempt to correct or reorder the brains of patients, though there was little understanding of how they actually worked or whether they had any real therapeutic effect. In this environment, the doctors were tasked with the nearly impossible job of diagnosing and treating individuals who were experiencing mental distress. But their diagnoses were often based on vague criteria, rooted in their own interpretations of what constituted normal behavior. Much of the medical community during this period still operated on a moralistic framework, believing that individuals who exhibited behaviors deemed immoral or unnatural were suffering from a mental disorder. As a result, many individuals were sent to the Ontario Hospital for behaviors that we would now understand as either a result of personal struggles, mental health challenges, or simply nonconformity to social norms. The doctors, who were not immune to the political and social pressures of the time, did little to challenge these beliefs. Instead, they perpetuated them by diagnosing patients based on these rigid and often arbitrary standards. The power of these doctors cannot be overstated. Their diagnoses determined the fate of their patients, whether they would be confined to the hospital for the rest of their lives, subjected to invasive treatments, or released back into society. In many cases, the doctors had complete control over the lives of their patients, and the patients had no say in the treatment they received. The patients themselves were often left in the dark about their diagnoses. For many, the process of being committed to the hospital was shrouded in secrecy. Families could admit their loved ones to the hospital with little to no oversight, and many patients were never told why they were being committed or how long they would remain there. This created an atmosphere of fear and helplessness among patients, who were often powerless to challenge the decisions made on their behalf. The role of the psychiatrists and administrators at Ontario Hospital was not only to treat but to control. They were not interested in healing the patients in the traditional sense, but rather in ensuring that those who were confined to the hospital could be managed and controlled. The methods used to treat patients reflected this priority. Electroshock therapy, for example, was widely used in an attempt to reset the minds of patients, a crude method that was more about enforcing submission than actual treatment. Lobotomies, which involved surgically altering the brain, were another common procedure. These interventions were not always seen as acts of medical treatment, but as ways of controlling behaviors deemed undesirable or insane. The doctors at Ontario Hospital often saw themselves as medical authorities in a world where the boundaries between sanity and insanity were unclear. But they were also shaped by the cultural biases and fears of their time. The widespread belief that insanity could be contagious, that it could spread like an infection, was one of the key factors that drove the mass institutionalization of people who were considered mentally ill. The idea of madness as a social disease that needed to be quarantined led to the rapid expansion of psychiatric institutions like Ontario Hospital. But this view of mental illness was also incredibly reductive. It failed to take into account the individual experiences of the patients or the complex interplay of factors that could contribute to mental distress. Instead, it relied on a simple binary notion of good versus evil, normal versus abnormal, sane versus insane. And in this system, anyone who did not fit into the narrow definition of normality was subject to being labeled as mad. One of the most unsettling aspects of the doctor's role in the Ontario Hospital was the degree to which they were complicit in a system that dehumanized patients. The medical professionals working at Ontario Hospital were not simply performing medical procedures. They were contributing to a broader system of social control. The hospital's focus was not on healing, but on maintaining order. The doctors who worked there were not always seeking to understand the patients they treated, but rather to control and regulate their behavior, often using methods that we would now consider barbaric. The goal was not to restore the patient's mental health, but to make them conform to the standards set by society. In this sense, the doctors were not just medical professionals, they were agents of a social system that prioritized conformity over individuality. While many of the doctors at Ontario Hospital were highly educated and well-trained, they were also constrained by the limitations of the medical knowledge of the time. The psychiatric profession was still grappling with basic questions about the nature of mental illness. While Freud and Jung were gaining prominence as pioneers in the field of psychology, their theories had not yet been widely accepted, and the practice of psychiatry was still heavily influenced by moral and religious views. This lack of understanding about the brain and mental illness often led to treatments that were not only ineffective, but also harmful. Doctors, in their attempts to heal, often made patients worse. The treatments they employed, such as electroshock therapy and lobotomies, were based on incomplete or faulty understanding of the brain, and they often resulted in permanent damage to the patients. In many cases, these treatments were used as a form of control rather than genuine healing. The patients were often treated as objects to be fixed or corrected, rather than as human beings deserving of compassion and understanding. The doctors at Ontario Hospital were not necessarily malicious. but they were complicit in a system that treated patients as less than human. The institution's mission was not to cure but to contain, and the doctors working there were tasked with managing the patients in whatever way they could, even if that meant subjecting them to inhumane treatments. But it is important to remember that these medical professionals did not exist in a vacuum. They were products of their time, influenced by the cultural, political, and medical climate of the 1930s. Their views on mental illness were shaped by societal norms, fears, and limitations. The concept of insanity was not something that was universally agreed upon, and the line between mental illness and moral failure was often unclear. The doctors at Ontario Hospital, like their counterparts in other institutions, were not simply treating patients, they were enforcing a rigid set of social rules and expectations, and in doing so, they became enforcers of a system that treated difference as disease. The legacy of these doctors is a complex one. While some of them may have genuinely believed in the treatments they administered, their actions nonetheless contributed to a system that caused immense harm to countless individuals. Their decisions shaped the fate of many patients, but they were also shaped by a system that valued conformity above all else. The role of the doctors at Ontario Hospital was not just to treat illness, it was to maintain control. And in doing so, they became complicit in a system that dehumanized and isolated those who were most vulnerable. The experiences of those who were confined within the walls of Ontario Hospital offer a sobering and often disturbing glimpse into a time when mental health was viewed through a lens of control, rather than compassion. For the patients who passed through its doors, the hospital became not just a place of medical treatment, but a symbolic prison where their identities were erased, their autonomy stripped away, and their lives dictated by a medical system that often saw them as nothing more than problems to be solved. The very act of entering Ontario Hospital meant that a person's life was about to be defined by a diagnosis that, in many cases, had nothing to do with actual mental illness. The label of insanity became a weapon, one that was wielded not just by doctors, but by society itself, as a means of maintaining control over individuals who were seen as out of step with the prevailing norms. The experience of patients at Ontario Hospital was often one of confusion and helplessness. Many were committed to the hospital by family members, sometimes without their consent or knowledge. Families, influenced by the cultural attitudes of the time, viewed the hospital as a solution to problems that they could not understand or deal with. A parent who was unable to control a child's rebellious behavior, a wife who challenged her husband's authority, or a husband who refused to adhere to traditional masculine ideals could all be labeled as insane and sent to the hospital for treatment. For these patients, the diagnosis of insanity became a punishment, one that forced them into a life of confinement, isolation, and subjugation. It was not a place of healing, but a place of judgment, where those who failed to conform to society's expectations were locked away, removed from the rest of the world. Once inside the hospital, patients were subjected to a variety of treatments that were not only invasive, but often harmful. The methods used to treat mental illness during this time were based on a medical model that viewed mental illness as a physical disease of the brain, rather than a complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors. Electroshock therapy, for instance, was widely used as a means of resetting the mind. This procedure, which involved sending an electrical current through the brain, was believed to alleviate symptoms of mental illness, but its long-term effects were largely unknown. In many cases, electroshock therapy left patients with permanent memory loss, cognitive impairments, and emotional numbness. It was a brutal, non-consensual treatment that could leave a patient feeling disoriented and broken, rather than healed. Lobotomies, another commonly used procedure at the time, were even more invasive. In a lobotomy, a surgeon would remove or sever parts of the brain in an attempt to control problematic behavior. This procedure was seen as a way to eliminate the most severe symptoms of mental illness, but it often resulted in profound personality changes, physical impairments, and a loss of cognitive function. The patients who underwent lobotomies often left the hospital in a state that was more incapacitated than cured. The procedure, which was performed on patients as young as teenagers, became one of the most controversial and damaging treatments in the history of psychiatry. For many patients, The real horror of Ontario Hospital was not just the treatments they endured, but the way they were treated as less than human. The hospital was not designed to treat individuals with dignity or empathy. It was a place of control, where patients were stripped of their rights and their humanity. Patients were often denied access to information about their diagnoses or treatment plans, leaving them in a perpetual state of uncertainty. They were not given the opportunity to question the authority of the medical professionals in charge, nor were they allowed to challenge the decisions made on their behalf. They were told what to do, what to think, and how to behave, with little regard for their personal feelings or desires. In many ways, the patients at Ontario Hospital became objects, defined not by their experiences or emotions, but by their diagnoses. Their stories were reduced to clinical notes, and their identities were lost in the process. Life inside the hospital was often isolating and dehumanizing. Patients were separated from their families and the outside world, forced to live in an environment that was both physically and emotionally stifling. Many were confined to small, sterile rooms, where they spent long hours alone with their thoughts, cut off from the human connections that might have helped them cope with their struggles. The hospital itself, with its cold stone walls and institutional design, served as a constant reminder of the patient's helplessness. There was no sense of warmth or comfort. Everything about the place reinforced the idea that the patients were there to be controlled, not to be cared for. The hospital became a symbol of the powerlessness that many felt in the face of a medical system that viewed them as little more than cases to be managed. The stigma associated with mental illness during this period only added to the suffering of the patients. Being diagnosed with insanity carried with it a heavy social stigma that extended far beyond the walls of the hospital. Patients who were labeled as insane were often viewed as dangerous, unpredictable, and unworthy of the same rights and privileges as those deemed sane. This stigma followed them throughout their lives, long after they left the hospital. Many former patients found it difficult, if not impossible, to reintegrate into society. They were often shunned by their families, ostracized by their communities, and rejected by employers. The label of insanity became a lifelong sentence, one that left individuals marked and marginalized. The experience of being diagnosed with insanity at Ontario Hospital was also deeply traumatic for those who sought to maintain their sense of self. In a place where patients were stripped of their identities and subjected to invasive treatments, the process of self-understanding became nearly impossible. Many patients struggled with the psychological effects of their diagnosis, grappling with feelings of confusion, fear, and shame. The label of insanity, once applied, could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more a person was told they were insane, the more they began to internalize this identity, eventually coming to believe that they were fundamentally different from those around them. The hospital, in this sense, became a factory for the creation of madness, where individuals were broken down, redefined, and ultimately left without the means to reclaim their own lives. There were also those who sought to resist the system, who fought to retain their individuality and sense of self in the face of overwhelming odds. Some patients attempted to escape, either physically or mentally, from the confines of the hospital. They fought against the treatments imposed upon them, often through acts of defiance or rebellion. But such acts of resistance were often met with punishment, and the consequences could be severe. Those who attempted to escape were often subjected to even harsher treatments, including more frequent electroshock therapy or longer periods of confinement. The hospital's power over its patients was absolute, and any attempt to break free from this control was met with a brutal response. For others, the experience of being institutionalized became a way of life. They learned to adapt to the rigid structure of the hospital, resigning themselves to their fate and accepting the routines of their confinement. For these individuals, the hospital became their entire world, a place where their sense of self was continuously eroded until it was almost unrecognizable. Many patients came to see themselves as mad because that was the only identity available to them. They were not allowed to explore their own mental states, to reflect on their emotions or experiences. Instead, they were defined by the label of insanity, and that label became the only truth they knew. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the patients' experiences at Ontario Hospital was the way they were treated as invisible. as non-entities who had no right to determine their own destinies. The staff of the hospital, though they may have been well-intentioned, were often so wrapped up in the institutional goals of control and management that they failed to see the patients as individuals. The patients were reduced to a series of symptoms and behaviors, stripped of their complexity and humanity. Their desires, their hopes, and their fears were dismissed as irrelevant in the face of their diagnosis. In this way, the patients were made invisible, not just by the physical walls of the hospital, but by the very system that was supposed to care for them. The stories of the patients at Ontario Hospital are a tragic testament to a system that prioritized control over care and conformity over understanding. For those who were confined within its walls, the experience was one of profound suffering, not just because of the treatments they endured, but because of the way they were treated as less than human. In the pursuit of managing mental illness, Ontario Hospital became a place where individuals were denied the most basic aspects of their humanity: autonomy, dignity, and self-respect. The patients who passed through its doors were often left broken, physically and psychologically, by a system that saw them as problems to be solved, rather than people to be cared for. And for many, the scars of their experiences at Ontario Hospital would never fade. The societal response to mental illness in the early 20th century was deeply intertwined with the economic, political, and cultural values of the time. At Ontario Hospital, the very fabric of its existence was a reflection of the social hierarchies that were shaping attitudes toward the mentally ill. The public perception of mental illness was largely shaped by fear, ignorance, and prejudice, leading to the widespread acceptance of institutionalization as the only solution to a complex and often misunderstood set of problems. The hospital's approach to dealing with mental illness was not merely a matter of medical care, it was a matter of social control. The institution was not just a place where patients went to heal. It was a place where society sought to manage, contain, and even punish those whose behavior was deemed unacceptable. It was here that the complexities of human behavior were simplified into labels of sanity and insanity, with little regard for the nuances of individual experience. Mental illness, during this period, was often understood through a binary lens. People were either sane or insane, and there was no in-between. This oversimplification of the human condition led to the stigmatization and marginalization of anyone whose behavior did not conform to society's strict norms. For many, simply being different in some way, whether through a non-traditional lifestyle, a rebellious spirit, or even a different worldview, was enough to be labeled insane and institutionalized. Those who dared to challenge the social norms of the time were viewed with suspicion, often seen as threats to the social order. It was this prevailing attitude that fueled the growth of institutions like Ontario Hospital, where individuals were subjected to harsh treatments and punitive measures for the simple crime of being nonconformist. The stigma attached to mental illness was pervasive and deeply ingrained in the fabric of society. Being labeled insane was not just a matter of losing one's freedom. It was a loss of identity, dignity, and social standing. The public perception of mental illness was colored by the belief that the mentally ill were dangerous, irrational, and unpredictable. They were often seen as a threat to the social order, and, in some cases, to public safety. As a result, institutions like Ontario Hospital were viewed as necessary for the protection of society, as they provided a way to isolate and manage those who were deemed dangerous or unfit to live among the normal population. But this view of the mentally ill as a threat to society was not just a product of fear. It was also a reflection of the values that underpinned society itself. The rise of industrialization and urbanization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries brought with it a new emphasis on productivity, efficiency, and order. As society became more focused on economic success and technological progress, there was little room for deviation from the norm. The mentally ill, who were often unable to contribute to the economic machine, were seen as a burden, an unnecessary drain on society's resources. As a result, the focus shifted from understanding and treating mental illness to managing it, containing it, and ensuring that it did not disrupt the orderly functioning of society. In this context, the treatment of mental illness became more about control than care. Those who were institutionalized were often subjected to inhumane treatments that were designed to subdue them, rather than help them heal. Electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and other forms of physical intervention were used not as curative measures, but as tools to force patients into compliance with the rigid social expectations of the time. The methods used in Ontario Hospital reflected a broader cultural belief that the mentally ill needed to be fixed or corrected, rather than understood. The hospital's treatments were not aimed at uncovering the root causes of mental distress. They were aimed at restoring order and conformity. In this sense, the hospital's role in society was not simply to provide medical care, but to serve as an instrument of social control, reinforcing the idea that deviation from the norm was something that needed to be eradicated. The way mental illness was treated at Ontario Hospital also reflected the gendered and class-based biases that were pervasive in the wider society. Women, in particular, were disproportionately affected by the psychiatric system of the time. The early 20th century was a time of significant social upheaval, as women began to demand greater autonomy and equality. However, this newfound independence was met with resistance, and many women who challenged the traditional roles imposed upon them were labeled as mentally ill. The term hysteria was often used to describe women who were seen as too emotional, too outspoken, or too rebellious. This diagnosis was frequently used as a way to silence women and control their behavior, effectively pathologizing any form of resistance to the status quo. Women who sought to challenge their prescribed roles, whether as wives, mothers, or daughters, were often sent to institutions like Ontario Hospital, where their behavior could be controlled and corrected. Similarly, men who failed to meet the societal expectations of masculinity were also at risk of being institutionalized. The rigid gender norms of the time dictated that men should be strong, stoic, and rational, and those who exhibited traits that were seen as weak or feminine were often considered to be mentally ill. Men who were overly sensitive, introverted, or emotional were frequently labeled as insane and sent to institutions for treatment. This view of mental illness was rooted in a cultural belief that the ideal man was a rational, self-disciplined individual who adhered to a strict set of behavioral norms. Any deviation from these norms was seen as a sign of instability or insanity, and as a result, men who did not fit this mold were often subjected to the same harsh treatments as women. Class also played a significant role in the treatment of mental illness. Those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds were more likely to be institutionalized than their wealthier counterparts. Poverty was often seen as a sign of moral or mental weakness, and individuals from lower classes were more likely to be viewed as dangerous or deviant. The mentally ill were often separated into different wards based on their class and social status, with wealthier patients receiving more favorable treatment. The stark contrast between the treatment of the wealthy and the poor highlights the ways in which the psychiatric system was not just about medicine, but about maintaining the existing social hierarchy. The treatment of mental illness at Ontario Hospital reflected a broader societal belief that the mentally ill were a burden on society. But those who were able to contribute economically or socially were treated with more care and respect. This dehumanizing approach to mental illness was not just a result of ignorance or malice, it was a product of the social and economic values that shaped society at the time. The treatment of the mentally ill, particularly those institutionalized at Ontario Hospital, was inextricably linked to a broader system of social control. The mentally ill were not seen as individuals with unique experiences and needs, but as problems to be fixed or hidden away. The very concept of mental illness was viewed through a moral lens. Those who exhibited behaviors that were seen as socially unacceptable were labeled as insane, and their differences were treated as a disease that needed to be eradicated. In this context, the institution of Ontario Hospital was not just a medical facility, it was a tool of social order. It became a place where society's anxieties about deviance and difference were projected onto individuals who were vulnerable and marginalized. The very idea of sanity became politicized, and mental illness was no longer understood as a personal struggle, but as a societal problem. In many ways, the hospital mirrored the broader cultural fears of the time, fears of social instability, fears of loss of control, and fears of change. The treatment of the mentally ill at Ontario Hospital was an attempt to control these fears to create a sense of order in a world that was rapidly changing. But as the decades passed, the treatment of mental illness began to evolve. The harsh methods employed at Ontario Hospital eventually gave way to more humane treatments, and the understanding of mental illness became more nuanced. Psychiatrists began to recognize that mental illness was not a moral failing or a sign of weakness, but a complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors. The rise of psychotherapy, the development of more effective medications, and the growing recognition of the importance of social support in mental health treatment all contributed to a shift in the way mental illness was understood and treated. Despite this progress, however, the legacy of institutions like Ontario Hospital continues to haunt us. The fear, stigma, and misunderstanding that shaped the treatment of mental illness in the past still influence how we view mental health today. Although we have made significant strides in the way we treat and understand mental illness, the scars left by the psychiatric system of the early 20th century remain. The patients who passed through the doors of Ontario Hospital may have been forgotten by history, but their stories of suffering, of isolation, and of control are a painful reminder of a time when mental illness was treated as a moral failing rather than a complex medical condition. And in many ways, their stories still resonate today as we continue to grapple with how to treat mental illness with the dignity and respect it deserves. The legacy of Ontario Hospital, and others like it, is a chilling testament to the failure of society to grasp the complexity of mental illness. In its time, the hospital was seen as a necessary institution, a place where people who did not fit the mold of normalcy could be safely contained and treated. Yet, beneath this veneer of benevolence, the hospital became a place where society's darkest fears and prejudices were projected onto the most vulnerable individuals. The patients, many of whom were not mentally ill in any conventional sense, were subjected to harsh treatments and dehumanizing conditions that left lifelong scars. The hospital's legacy is not only one of medical malpractice and institutional cruelty, but also one of profound societal failure, a failure to understand the human condition and to treat those who were suffering with the dignity and respect they deserved. The very concept of mental illness in the early 20th century was influenced by the cultural norms and fears of the time. The rise of industrialization and urbanization had brought about significant changes in society, creating an environment of intense social pressure. The old ways of life were being replaced by a new order, and with that came a deep fear of chaos and disorder. The mentally ill, or those who simply failed to conform to social expectations, became the scapegoats for society's anxieties. The fear of madness was a fear of losing control, of breaking down the structures that upheld the social order. The idea of mental illness was therefore closely tied to ideas of morality, productivity, and social conformity. People who exhibited behaviors deemed socially unacceptable were seen as diseased, a threat to the stability of society, and thus in need of containment. The patients at Ontario Hospital were not always mentally ill in the way we understand the term today. Many of them were people who had simply fallen outside the rigid boundaries of acceptable behavior. Some were suffering from the effects of trauma, abuse, or poverty, while others were simply unable or unwilling to fit into the narrow definitions of normality. They may have been people who refused to conform to traditional gender roles, who dared to speak out against political authority, or who simply felt disconnected from the increasingly mechanized world around them. In a time when individual autonomy was not as highly valued as it is today, the mentally ill were seen as failures in the eyes of society, failures that needed to be hidden away, controlled, or erased. This understanding of mental illness was deeply entrenched in the medical community, which was still developing its understanding of psychiatry. The early 20th century saw the rise of psychoanalysis, a new and largely untested theory that emphasized the role of the unconscious mind in shaping behavior. This approach, developed by figures like Sigmund Freud, would have a profound impact on the way mental illness was perceived and treated. At the same time, however, psychiatry was still largely dominated by more physicalist approaches that sought to treat mental illness through invasive procedures like electroshock therapy and lobotomies. These treatments were designed not to understand or heal the patient's mind, but to subdue and control them. The use of these methods, was not only a reflection of the medical community's lack of understanding about mental illness, but also of a deep-seated belief that the mentally ill were inherently dangerous and needed to be managed and controlled at all costs. The institution of Ontario Hospital served as a microcosm of the broader societal attitudes toward mental illness. The patients who were confined there were often stripped of their identities and their agency. The process of institutionalization was not just about treatment. It was about silencing those who were seen as disruptive to the social order. Those who were labeled as insane were often denied the right to make decisions about their own lives, including decisions about their treatment. They were subjected to medical procedures that they did not understand and that were often performed without their consent. The doctors, despite their claims to medical authority, were complicit in a system that treated patients as objects to be managed rather than individuals to be cared for. The relationship between doctor and patient was not one of trust or empathy, but one of authority and submission. The patients were not viewed as human beings struggling with mental distress, but as problems that needed to be fixed, pacified, or erased. This dehumanizing treatment was compounded by the physical conditions within the hospital. The patients lived in overcrowded, underfunded, and poorly maintained wards where they were subjected to harsh conditions. The hospital was a place of isolation and confinement, a place where patients were cut off from their families, communities, and the outside world. The lack of meaningful human connection in the hospital further exacerbated the patient's suffering. They were subjected to long periods of solitude, where they had little to no contact with others, and their lives were dictated by the institutional routine. This institutionalization of patients was not just a physical process, it was a psychological one as well. The patients were made to feel invisible, as though their lives no longer mattered. They were reduced to a series of symptoms and diagnoses, stripped of their individuality and personhood. For many patients, the trauma of being institutionalized at Ontario Hospital was not just the result of the medical treatments they underwent, but of the psychological toll of being treated as less than human. The loss of personal autonomy, the denial of one's identity, and the experience of being rendered invisible all contributed to the profound sense of powerlessness that many patients felt. The emotional and psychological scars left by the institution were not easily erased. In many cases, they would last a lifetime. Those who managed to escape the clutches of the hospital often faced difficulties reintegrating into society. The stigma of having been institutionalized followed them wherever they went. They were seen as damaged, broken, and forever marked by their experiences. The legacy of Ontario Hospital also lies in the ways it contributed to the broader narrative of mental illness. The institution's practices reinforced the idea that mental illness was something to be feared and controlled, rather than understood and treated with compassion. It perpetuated a view of the mentally ill as fundamentally different from the rest of society, as something other that needed to be isolated and managed. This mindset shaped the way mental illness was discussed in the public sphere and influenced the development of psychiatric practices for years to come. It was not until much later, with the advent of more progressive views on mental health, that this paradigm began to shift. The practice of institutionalization, however, did not simply disappear with the advent of more humane treatments for mental illness. The legacy of Ontario Hospital and similar institutions continues to shape the way we think about mental health today. While the physical treatment of the mentally ill has evolved, the stigma and societal exclusion associated with mental illness persist. Even today, people with mental health issues are often marginalized and isolated, and their struggles are still misunderstood. The fear of madness and the desire for control over those who are perceived as different remain deeply ingrained in the collective consciousness. The treatment of mental illness has improved in many ways, but the shadow of institutions like Ontario Hospital still looms large. One of the most enduring aspects of this legacy is the way mental illness is often treated as a moral failing rather than a medical condition. In the early 20th century, the mentally ill were viewed as morally weak, as people who had failed to adhere to the social and cultural expectations of the time. This moralistic view of mental illness continues to have a profound impact on how people with mental health issues are treated today. Those who suffer from conditions like depression, anxiety, or schizophrenia are often still viewed with suspicion or fear, and the stigma associated with these conditions can be just as debilitating as the illness itself. Despite advances in the understanding of mental health, the remnants of the past still shape our attitudes toward those who are mentally ill. In many ways, the history of Ontario Hospital serves as a reminder of the dangers of institutionalization, not just in the literal sense, but in the broader cultural context. The institution was not just a place where people were confined physically, it was a place where individuals were reduced to their diagnoses and their differences, stripped of their identities and their humanity. This dehumanizing process did not end with the closure of the hospital, but has continued in subtler forms in the way society views mental illness. The legacy of Ontario Hospital is not just about the treatment of mental illness in the past. It is about how that treatment has shaped the way we view and interact with those who are mentally ill today. The ghosts of the past continue to haunt the present, and it is only by confronting this legacy head-on that we can begin to understand and heal the wounds that have been inflicted on those who have suffered from the psychiatric system.